Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening. My name is Benjamin Quinn, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard University Division of Science, and the Harvard Library, I'm honored to introduce this virtual event with Carlos Lalueza-Fox, presenting his book, Inequality, A Genetic History, in conversation with David Reich. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you for joining us virtually. Tonight's event is the latest installment in our Harvard Science Book Talk series, which works to bring the authors of recently published science literature to our Cambridge community and beyond. Coming up in the series on Wednesday, March 9th, we'll host celebrated psychologist Catherine Page Harden for her new book, The Genetic Lottery: Why DNA Matters for Social Equality. To learn more about this and our upcoming virtual events, you can visit harvard.com and sign up for our email newsletter, or check out the page harvard.com/science for more info. I'll also be posting a link to our Science Research Public Lectures channel in the chat, where you can view previous talks you might have missed. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our authors at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase Inequality, A Genetic History on harvard.com. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you to our partners at Harvard University, and thank you all for showing up and tuning in support of authors, publishers, indie bookselling, and especially for science. And finally, as you have no doubt experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we will do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. Now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Carlos Lalueza-Fox is a research professor at the Institute of Evolutionary Biology in Barcelona. As a leading paleogeneticist, he has participated in the Neanderthal Genome Project and also led the first retrieval of the genome of an 8,000-year-old European hunter-gatherer individual. He's the author of the previous book, De-Extinctions, A Quick Immersion, and his research on the retrieval of genomic data from prehistoric individuals has been featured in several publications, including Nature and Science. Tonight, he is joined in conversation by David Reich, professor of genetics and human evolutionary biology at Harvard and an investigator of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. For his work, including the 2018 publication of the celebrated book, Who We Are and How We Got Here, one of our favorites here at Harvard Bookstore, Dr. Reich has received several awards, including the 2020 Darwin Wallace Award from the Linnaean Society of London, the 2019 National Academy of Sciences Award, Molecular Biology, and the 2021 Mastery Prize. This evening, Carlos and David have joined us for a discussion of Carlos's latest book, Inequality, A Genetic History, a timely look into the deep history of inequality, which Nobel laureate James Heckman calls extraordinary, a book which brings to life exciting new research on ancient DNA to understand the emergence of inequality in human societies over the millennia. Inequality is an urgent global concern, with pundits, politicians, and academics, as well as best-selling books, all taking up its causes and consequences. Making use of novel DNA sequencing technologies, Dr. Lalueza-Fox offers an entirely new perspective on the subject, journeying into millennia past in order to explore the effects of ancient inequality on the contemporary human gene pool. We've got a lot to learn this evening, so without further ado, I'm delighted to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is all yours, Carlos and David.
Okay, so let me share the screen. I will show first a presentation with some of the ideas I have developed in the book. Just to mention that many of these ideas are also to be found in David's previous book, Who We Are and How We Got Here, and they are based on kind of a new information that is emerging from the analysis of ancient human genomes. Some of the ideas can be found, as we will see, from modern genetic data, but without the possibility of having ancient genomes from space and time, is difficult to know some of the questions that are shown in the modern data. This is a map of modern genetic data is built on about 600,000 variable positions in the human genome and several hundreds of modern Europeans. And when this kind of analysis were published already 10 years, more than 10 years ago, most of it is modern data. What was possible to see is that it emerged the kind of the map of Europe in very, let's say, general terms. There are some gaps, of course. It's not a perfect map. Some of the gaps are simply because some populations are not well represented. But the general idea of that is that there is enough information in the genomes, even in Europe, which is considered the most, genetically most uniform continent, to mimic geography. So we don't use geography for anything. When the populations labels are painted after the analysis, this is just a principal component analysis where we compress all the information, this enormous amount of genetic information we have, and then it emerges the kind of a map of Europe. So I know most of you cannot read probably the labels, but here are the Spanish populations, Portugal, France, Great Britain, Scandinavia, Germany. I mean, there are some gaps, of course, Italy, Greece, the Near East, north of Africa, and then we go to the Middle East, etc., to the Iran and other populations. So, of course, when these kind of maps were first published, the question that comes to the mind is when this structure was generated in the past. But then that's the question. Without the ancient data, the whole idea that was difficult to test. Of course, the first hypothesis that comes in mind to explain this kind of genetic structure is the big transition that took place with the arrival of farming into Europe. As you know, the farming was emerged 10,000 years ago in the Near East, in the Middle East, and then it spread through Europe, following different routes, one in the north shores of the Mediterranean, the other one following the Danube River to the central plains of Europe. And this can be explored archaeologically because, among other things, there are many sites, and the first farmers had things that the previous hunter-gatherers didn't have, like pottery that can be, recognized archaeologically. So, in absence of any kind of genetic data, the suggestion was that this structure we were seeing in modern Europeans was basically attributable to these migrations. But of course, it is difficult to look at the archaeological record without genetic data. I mean, it has been done for hundreds, well, not hundreds, but tens of years, and there are many issues that make it difficult to understand what we are seeing in the archaeological record, not only in terms of migrations, because sometimes people who is migrating, they really look like the people who was previously there, at least at the skeleton level, but also if we want to look at things like social structure. For instance, we have in the Upper Paleolithic, these are reconstructions. We have this man in Sungir, in Russia, which is clearly is a person who had very sophisticated clothing, and it has been estimated that only for the 3,000 mammoth ivory bits it had in the clothes, the group where this man was living, really they need to manufacture for hundreds of hours to make these clothes. But of course, we don't know what does it mean in terms of social structure, inequality in the group, or how this finding can be generalized. I mean, is an exception, is a leader, is an important person, is really difficult to know just looking at the archaeological record. But also, even from an anthropological point of view, the most basic information that could be the sex of the individuals is sometimes unclear. And this below there is this other example of the famous triple burial of Domi Bestonice, where there were supposed to be 3 teenagers buried. One was supposed to, in the middle one was supposed to be a woman, a young woman, and then they are buried in a very strange way. One was buried face down, the other was buried with the hands on the pubic region of what's supposed to be the woman, and it clearly had a very high symbolic meaning. And the hypothesis, at least when I was studying some decades ago in anthropology, was that the woman was a higher status woman that maybe died during pregnancy, and then the shaman was executed, etc. Something, or a love triangle, or something that happened. But very recently, just a genetic study on these individuals, in a study that also was led by David, just shown that the 3 individuals are in fact 3 males. So all the interpretation that took place just from the fossil record, or the archaeological record, needs to be rebuilt. I mean, it can be still, can still be a love triangle or something, but clearly we have problems for dealing even with the most basic data, which is in this case the sex of the individuals. And of course, if the structure we have seen in modern genetic data in Europe is something that is related to the turnover of the arrival of the farming, a pertinent question is to ask ourselves how the populations that were previous to the arrival of the farming look like. So how were the hunter-gatherers that lived before the arrival of agriculture in Europe? And I put this, is an artistic representation, and I found in internet. I like it for several reasons, just to show that these hunter-gatherers were not brutish and primitive people, that they could, they could have, a sophisticated culture. Some of the things are of course invented, like the hair and so on, the style, which is just an artistic interpretation, but it's fine. They were reasonably sophisticated. But the other thing that I wanted to show you is that these people didn't look like these ones. So physically they were different, and this is another thing that we have learned from the retrieval of ancient genomes from these hunter-gatherers that were before the arrival of the farmers. So 8,000 years ago, it turns out that the hunter-gatherers in Europe, they all had, or most of them had, the mutation, underlying the blue eyes in modern Europeans. Even the hunter-gatherers that were in Southern Europe, where blue eyes nowadays are rare, let's say, showing this map. Of course, the higher frequency of blue eyes are in Northern Europe. And the genomic composition, let's say, of these people is nowadays gone. So there are no modern Europeans that are 100% genetically like the hunter-gatherers that were 8,000 years ago, but the ancestries are still partially preserved in northern Europe around Scandinavia, which it makes sense in general if we think that there the farming is in principle not as a good option, climatically, as in the rest of Europe. So so now the European populations, they have different ratios of this ancestry, which is gone, and the very last hunter-gatherer, I mean, the very last person with a hunter-gatherer complete genome, I think it has been found in Poland about 6,300 years ago. But by the way, in a farming community. But there are also other differences, and these also can be ascertained from the genetics, and it's something that we will never know just looking at the anthropological remains of these people. And when these the genes that are related to pigmentation that has been checked in these ancient genomes, it turns out that the hunter-gatherers in Europe, they had the ancestral variants in these two crucial genes for light pigmentation in modern Europeans. So clearly they had to have a kind of darker pigmentation than modern Europeans, but with blue eyes. And then we start having genomes from the early farmers that met these people and absorbed these people by mixing with them. These early farmers look different. Interestingly, they had fair skin and dark eyes, and as I mentioned before, spread through Europe in different routes, let's say, and eventually they replaced the hunter-gatherers. And now the ancestry of these early farmers is mostly present in the, let's say, the north shores of the Mediterranean. And then they decrease as we go further north in the continent. So all this story of migrations, of course, they are interesting by themselves, and I would say that probably me and probably David also, when we start in this kind of studies, we were essentially trying to understand the genetic composition of modern populations, as I have shown in Europe, by trying to understand the different migrations that have been overimposed a long time. But in fact, migrations are not only changes in the ancestry composition, but also are ways prone to create inequality and dominance. And as we'll see different examples where this happens associated to these ancestry turnovers that we are exploring. So the ancient DNA has had the power to go from understanding these past migrations, and we are still exploring some of them, to understanding also the social consequences for the populations where these turnovers took place. And let me show, we are still in the Neolithic, let me show you a study that was published in December, also made by David, associated to these megalithic cultures. The megalithic it happens in the Neolithic, in this, once the farmers are all over the continent, is characterized by this structure of big stones, like the famous Stonehenge in England, but also in England there is this barrow called Hazeltown that is it had this aspect, but it has been destroyed some decades ago, but the remains that were buried inside this barrow in these two chambers, the north chamber and the south chamber, they have been preserved and they have been recently analyzed by ancient DNA techniques. And then what emerged from this study is quite interesting for understanding the societies that could happen in these, at least in these megalithic cultures. What the author found is that there was a kind of a patriarch, let's say, a man who had children. I was going to say who married, but I don't know if is the right word. Had children with 4 different women, and of course we don't know. It's difficult to know if this was a kind of successive women or a kind of polygamy. And then this community, which is clearly is more than a family, is a clan, I would say, is a structure at least in 5 generations, the people that was buried into this barrow, along with the, let's say, the founder of the community. And there are many interesting things here to see. There is a kind of a structure also in the chambers. The south chamber is mainly for descendants of one of these women, and the north chamber for the other one. But there are interesting things, as I say, that, for instance, a certain lack of women in the clan. When there is, when there are women, sometimes they are they died in childhood, and also the women, they are clearly foreign. They came from outside the clan because they don't have parents or they don't have brothers, for instance, in the barrow. So this points out to a kind of a social structure which is known as female exogamy or patrilocality, which essentially means that men remain in the family where they are born, while the females are quite mobile, and they probably are interchanged between clans, among clans, to try to make alliances or something. And also an interesting thing, which is difficult to understand also, but is two of these women, they had also children with other men which are not found within the kind. So this is another example of things that can be done with paleogenetics. If you imagine all these remains sometimes are just single tooth or broken fragments, it would be absolutely impossible to obtain this degree of information about not only the genetic relationships, but also the social structure that could have in these communities. And then there is another evidence for yet another megalith, which is very famous in Ireland, in Newgrange, where this is gigantic structure. And there is a very long chamber where the first light of I don't remember if the summer solstice or the winter solstice go through the chamber, through this tunnel and illuminates the final chamber. And then there is the remains of a man that had also been found in this very important place of the structure and analyzed genetically, and turned out that 25%, about 1/4 of his genome, had no variation at all, which is all the sections that can be shown here in the chromosomes of this individual. Of course, we have to remember that we share 50% of our genome. We got 50% of our genome from each of our parents, and we share also 50% with each of our siblings. because it helps every generation we go back. And to have these 25% of chromosomes with no variation, it means that the parents of this individual, they had to be first-degree relatives, maybe let's say siblings, or maybe parent of offspring, or let's say father with a daughter, or maybe siblings. Whenever the combination, what is interesting is that this is pretty unusual in many human societies. I mean, it has been recorded in historical times. For instance, in ancient Egypt, it's known that the pharaoh Akhenaten got married apparently with two of his daughters. And this kind of happens when the inequality is so high, the hierarchy in the society is so high that you cannot really marry anyone outside the family, because then you will dilute the exceptionality of the bloodline, let's say. And this is the famous, some of the famous reliefs in Amarna, and this the glamorous, let's say, depiction of two of the daughters of Akhenaten. And just to remind us about the social structure, very recently in Amarna, they have been excavating necropolis where they found hundreds, literally hundreds of skeletons buried together without any kind of ceremony, and that represent very young children, teenagers sometimes, but that sometimes just children that apparently had been doing a very heavy work and had many lesions, carrying heavy weights, etc., apparently for the construction of the city of the pharaoh. And also, this kind of endogamy is not exclusive of the old pharaohs. It happened also in the Ptolemaic dynasty. For instance, you can see here Ptolemy IV. He married his own sister, Arsinoe, hence his nickname, Ptolemy Philadelphus. But also Cleopatra, for instance, married first one of his brothers, Ptolemy XIII, and then the other one, Ptolemy XIV. And in this case, I would say that it is probably because the Ptolemaics, they were Macedonians. In fact, the dynasty came from the first Ptolemy Soter, who was a general of Alexander the Great, and he was a Macedonian, and then he established himself in Egypt. And although the Ptolemaics adopt many things of the Egyptian culture, like the religion and even the general aesthetics and so on, they clearly were in a very small community, the Macedonian community, and essentially they could not marry, let's say, outside the family with someone of other ancestry, let's say. So far about the kind of endogamy in this period, but then the paleogenetics has shown still another genetic turnover in Europe, which is the arrival of the steppe nomads about 5,000 years ago, the arrival from the steppes, from the Pontic steppes to the east of Europe, and then the spread of this ancestry across Europe that can be traced in different genetic studies. And these nomads, maybe they had this kind of yurt, this is just a modern picture from Mongolia. They had some kind of a military advantage because they had domesticated horses. They also had baboons, so they were highly mobile, and they could transport people and things. They were based on herds of horses and cow and sheep and goats. And there are evidences of violence at the end of the Neolithic when this happened in Europe. The Neolithic communities, they were immersed in their own crisis, but some of these violence could be related to the arrival of these people. And they had other interesting things like individual burials, these kurgans, that are built on top of sometimes a single burial, single inhumation of a clearly an important person for the community. And again, these represented the effort for several weeks of the whole community to make these gigantic structures in some cases. So we have seen evidences of social hierarchy in the megalithic culture, but this is also a general signal of social structure within these steppe nomads. And for instance, this is another work done from genetics, is a mass grave from kind of the period of contact with these Yamnaya, these steppe nomads, in which the relationships, the family relationships, have been discovered. You can see there are several families here, and one interesting idea is that maybe the people who bury this dead, they knew about their family links because they put, for instance, two brothers together, mothers with children, etc. And another interesting thing is that there is a certain lack of adult males that maybe were abroad or escaped, we just don't know. And again, this shows us the power of these techniques in looking at the archaeological record with different eyes, because that would be impossible to know without genetic information. Just looking at the skeletons, nobody would be able to guess the family links among these individuals. Another thing we see related to the arrival of the steppe nomads is that the Y chromosome they carry, especially the R1b, is just the name. The geneticists label one of these branches of the paternal chromosomes increase after the arrival of these people to the extremes in Western Europe, for instance, in Ireland or in the Basque Country, where 80%, sometimes more than 80% of the males still carry this single lineage. And of course, this the Y chromosome is what we call an uniparental marker. It's less informative in many ways than the whole genome, but also it has the potentiality of informing us about sex biases, as we will see. Just to remind you that we have, the number of our ancestors doubles each generation. And of course, if we go back in time, we have many genealogical ancestors, but only one is the ancestor that has given us, if we are males, our Y chromosome. But this is similar to what happens with the mitochondrial DNA, which is a small circular genome that is inside our cells, and in this case is inherited through the mothers. The situation will be similar. We'll have in this case, the mitochondrial genome, we'll have it through my mother, through the mother of my mother, etc., but not from the rest of my ancestors. But this is very interesting because it shows there is some kind of strong gender bias associated to this, the arrival of this ancestry in Europe, but not only in Europe. Then this can be observed also in India. The arrival of the ancestry takes place slightly later than in Europe, but creates also, let's say, a gradient, a climb from northwest to southeast, but also is more prevalent in the higher castes and the Brahmins. So clearly there is here not only a migration, I mean the signal of a migration that took place in the past, but also a signal of a social structure linked to this migration, in the sense that the higher, the highest the component of the step of this step ancestry, is higher in the upper class and is higher in the north of the Indian continent. And also it could be somehow associated to the disappearance of one of the paradigmatic early cultures, civilizations, the Indus civilization, that ends up around that time. And also David analyzed one skeleton from this kind of environment, which is clearly the worst probably environment for DNA preservation, and the skeleton didn't have the signals of step ancestry yet. And then we can look at the arrival of this step ancestry, as I said, somehow is biased in many ways. And for instance, in Iberia, we see the arrival of this ancestry. The higher the individual, these are different individuals. In colors, those are males that have different Y chromosomes. The higher the individual, the higher the step ancestry component. And then there is an overlap of people without step ancestry for about 400 years. 400 years is similar to the period of overlapping of the colonization, the European colonization of the Americas. So I think the scale is quite similar. What happened is that at the end of this overlapping, there is no one without a step ancestry. And here is very variable. Of course, they mix with the locals, and then they end up having about 20–25% of a step ancestry, which is what we found more or less in modern Iberian populations. And then what is more interesting is that the Y chromosomes that are prevalent in the Iberian Neolithic, they are all gone. So essentially the I2 and G2, these blue, green colors, they disappear, and then we only see the red one, which is the R1b. Here we have a blue one, but it is already close to the Punic arrival in southern Spain. So as I say, this is clearly a process that takes place slowly, let's say, that lasts several hundreds of years, but involves not only the turnover of the genome of these populations, as we have been seeing before, but also a significant bias by sex. So essentially what happens is that local males here, they stop having children. And we were lucky to find let's say an illustration of how the process could have happened. In this site in the middle of Spain, we got this double burial, a man and a woman, and then the man had the step ancestry and the woman didn't have. And not only that, the woman had by isotopes, it was possible to deduce it had a marine diet, and the coast is about 200 kilometers. The nearest coast to this site is about 200 kilometers from the burial. So I think this illustrates clearly the social mechanism which is underlying this genetic change. Of course, we don't know how was implemented at a whole scale, but at the end, when we see a genetic turnover, of course, this it happens. It has to go down to the people, to individuals taking decisions and having children. And I think this is very illustrative. And also then in the Bronze Age, we keep having evidences of these kind of hierarchies established with in this period. For instance, in this different sites in southern Germany, it has been possible to reconstruct several pedigrees, in this case up to 5 generations. And then we find similar things to what we have seen in Hazelton, although in this case there's only one, a man and a woman, but again, there is a lack of daughters, let's say, and a lack of brothers and parents from the women that had children in the community. And also, again, it's another interesting thing we can do now with paleogenetics is associate all these family links and all the ancestry changes to grave gods. And then we have, in this site, we have people buried forming a clan or a family with signals of hierarchy, like gold and daggers and pottery in their graves, buried alongside people who has essentially nothing, and they are not related to the families. There are many more examples to come. This is in the Punic period. These are hypogeums excavated in the rock. These, for instance, of course, this is very expensive. Let's say these are burials from the ancient city of Baria, what is now in south in Almeria, in south of Spain, and this was, of course, costly to build and to bury the people inside. And also, we have evidences of luxury items like these ostrich eggs that are found in some of these hypogeums. And when we analyzed one of these hypogeums, we found, for instance, in one of them, several people that were clearly Greek in ancestry. So they are not Iberian, they are clustering here with modern Greeks. And I think this is interesting for several reasons, but one of them is it also can have an impact on the interpretation of history. It's Hannibal, the Punic general who fought against the Romans. He tried to establish an alliance with some Greek cities in Italy, and against the Romans. And then the discovery of a Greek community in what is otherwise a Punic city in southern Spain, I think is interesting because it gives Hannibal the opportunity to interact with Greek people and maybe establishing this kind of alliance. But so we can see this is a map I found with all the known Greek colonies in the Mediterranean, and then there you can see that is known here where we found this a small group of Greeks established in the ancient Baria city. But not only that, these Greeks, they also had signals of endogamy, as we have seen in other studies. This happened when the community is very isolated, it's very small, and at least for several generations, the small Greek community of Baria, clearly they married each other to a certain level of endogamy. And then endogamy is an interesting thing to explore also from genetics. And we have seen the arrival of the steppe ancestry in India likely associated to the caste system. And then when we look at the persistence of this system, the system is illegal. I mean, it was abolished with the independence of India, but it operates quite highly still. I mean, if you look at these statistics, in many regions of India, 95% of the marriages take place within the caste, within the particular division. So that means it has these social structures, which are, as I say, they don't have any law support now. They have a very strange persistence, just from social traditions, and they have also implications for genetics, as I have seen here. Of course, India is not the only place where castes exist. There were caste systems in New Spain, what is now Mexico. Of course, the Spanish were on top of them, and also, followed by people, descendants of the Spanish, and then there were this funny mixing that were all categorized depending of the different kind of marriages that took place. And another step further in discrimination and inequality is what happens with the slavery, which is especially in the, let's say, in the formation of Americas. And now ancient DNA is also starting analyzing the remains of some of these slaves. But until now, this is something that could also be studied from modern genetics. And from modern genetics, we could see very interesting trends in the shaping of modern Americans. For instance, in this study, we have, this is modern data, we have the ancestry component in the self-attribute Black American community, which is higher in the South, and then the European ancestry in the same community, which is higher in the North, but interestingly, it goes up to more than 30%. So the people who consider themselves to be Black Americans or African Americans, they have a significant amount of the genome that comes from Europeans. And then when we look at these uniparental markers I mentioned before, this would be the mitochondrial DNA and this is the Y chromosome, then we see these extraordinary differences in the frequency. This would be the African American community, the European American community. We'll see in the African American one, the maternal lineage is mostly of African origin, but for instance here, the Y chromosome, about a third of the Y chromosome are from Europeans. This is even more extreme in this community in Brazil, where most of the mitochondrial DNA is from Africa, but half of the Y chromosome, the paternal lineage, is from European populations. Which means that the melting of the Americas with natives Americans, African, and Europeans essentially took place with European males monopolizing females from the other two communities. And just another thing that we can see is these kind of structures in the Y chromosome. We have been talking a bit about the Y chromosome, and then when this is a study again with modern genetic data that showed that a specific lineage that had a high prevalence in Asia and increase in frequency in very recent times, and it could be estimated that maybe was the Y chromosome of Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan not only had many concubines and women, but also he had several descendants that were also had an enormous empire, and this lasted for several hundreds of years. So it's very likely that this boosts his own Y chromosome to these high frequencies nowadays. So clearly the Y chromosome is something that is shaped by inequality in many ways, and we can see this representation of the Y chromosome on the left and the mitochondrial DNA on the right. The mitochondrial DNA is not affected. The different lineages in the different continents, they are not affected by any demographic phenomena, but it clearly happens something with the Y chromosome around the end of the Neolithic, the Bronze Age. So about 5,000 years ago, many of the lineages collapse and others expand a lot. So to conclude, several ideas that are in this presentation, but also in my book. I would say that now with paleogenetics, it's possible to reconstruct these changes in ancestry related to migrations. Remember, the migrations can be prone to episodes of inequality, these shifts. As we can see, some of these are gender biased, and they are they create these societies which are patrilocal, patrilineal, in many ways probably patriarchal. Another interesting idea, I think, is that inequality was prevalent in the past, and therefore wealthy people, wealthy men probably had many more children than common people, which means that we have likely these people who practice inequality in the past among our genetic ancestors. And also, if this was a trend, at least in several periods, then a thing that can be deduced is that women have contributed more than men to current human genetic diversity. And also, if you want to know which is the most affected genetic marker by inequality, is the Y chromosome. And with this, I don't know if there are questions, or David, if has some comments, you are welcome also.
Hello. Am I on? Hello, do people hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Carlos. I very much enjoyed the presentation. And I just wanted to make a few comments really focused on your book. And I might want to start by reading some quotes from your book that I think really highlight some of the messages from the book. So I published this book a few years ago that was about the ancient DNA revolution and how it is addressing questions about our past that were difficult to address before. And I wanted to start by reading a quote where you discuss, you're very flattering about the book, but what you say is, Reich's book had a positive message because these repeated mixtures of populations constitute a scientific argument against, quote, pure populations and racial classifications. What I reveal in the following chapters, however, like an ominous epilogue, is the story of these past migrations is one of inequality. And I think that is a real subtext of the findings from the DNA revolution, that the rule, not the exception, is that when peoples come together, that relations between the people is typically one of asymmetric relationships amongst those populations and producing offsprings that, for example, you can see and appreciate with the men and the women from the two populations contributing differently to the offspring. So I think this is an incredibly important feature that one learns from the genetic data. And that's actually quite troubling because it shows how inequality that we see in our own world today projects far, far in the past. Thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, essentially in every single population that we look. Another comment, another point I wanted to read is one from the introductory section of your book, where you talk about the consequences of inequality. You say, I want to elucidate, the question I want to elucidate in this book is whether differences in wealth give some individuals advantage over others in reproduction, thus entangling social and genetic factors in a complex way and effectively modifying the genomic composition of subsequent generations. So what you're saying here is that maybe the inequality means that the people who are involved in exploitation are unusually successful in transmitting their genetic material to offspring, and that we today are to an unusual extent a product of that inequality. So you're right. Consequently, if this is in fact the case, we can safely assume that we carry a higher genomic fraction from those who benefited from inequality in the past, if only by probability. I think this is an interesting thought. Let's keep it rolling in our minds. By the way, please, audience or participants, please put questions in the Q&A that Carlos or myself could address going forward. Another point that I wanted to raise, I think you have a beautiful discussion in your book about something you touched on your slides, which is the evidence of extreme exploitation associated with the transatlantic slave trade and the exploitation of indigenous Native American populations in the Americas by European colonialists. You write, for example, that among 27,000, quote, liberated slaves that were relocated to St. Helena Island by British Royal Navy ships intercepting slave ships, there was a great asymmetry in males and females. For example, 17 individuals were males, only 3 were females, none of them genealogically related, confirming the extreme male bias in the slave trade. We know that already from the historical records, but actually what you describe in the book is that the contribution of African ancestry to the mixed populations of the Americas is very much on the female side. So even though it's extremely asymmetrically male in terms of the people coming over, those males were less successful than the females in terms of transmitting their DNA to their offspring. Many, the great majority of those males were unsuccessful at transmitting their DNA because of the history of exploitation on this continent. So I just wanted to highlight some of these points. You know, an example of this concretely is there was just a paper on the transatlantic slave trade. And you see that in, for example, if you look at the European ancestry in the British Caribbean, places like Jamaica, it's coming 26-1. The European ancestry is coming from the male side, not the female side. It's much less, but still extreme in the United States, about 3 or 4-1. Okay, maybe we can open this now to discussion of the Q&A. There's one question that was raised by Sofia Vutsaki, writing, "You're reaching interesting conclusions on social structure, but wouldn't your conclusions be even more interesting if you had included also the archaeological data on burial treatment in, for example, the barrow from Hazleton North that you presented? And wouldn't such an integrated approach combining different data sets be a more fertile research direction?" So I think I can answer that question in part because a reading of the book, I think, will provide a satisfying answer to that question. I think what Carlos presented here was really the genetic evidence of asymmetry and the contribution of men and women to different populations, or asymmetry in the behavior of people with 2 X chromosomes and an X and Y chromosome as they were buried in a tomb. But actually, I think what this book is better than my own book at doing is really contextualizing the genetic data in light of the archaeological evidence from these sites. For example, the slide that Carlos presented on the Left Valley study in southern Germany in the Bronze Age really is focused, and the presentation and discussion of that study is focused on not just presenting the patrilineal behavior where women are coming in from outside and men are joining patrilineally defined households, but is really describing how that's related to grave goods, the rich goods that are buried, that are associated with the families, the much poorer goods associated with the peripheral burials, and so on. Do other people have comments, or Carlos, you might want to add something to that?
Yes, well, the only thing is that Hazleton, of course, is not in my book because it was published last December. But it was such a great example that I couldn't resist to include it in the presentation because it's unique in many ways. But I agree that if the question is we should take in consideration the archaeological context, of course. What we are trying to make here is not prioritize one evidence over the other, but try to make multidisciplinary interpretation of the past and look at the past with different eyes and new evidence. But of course, we both, me and David, we work very closely with other disciplines, not only archaeology, but also anthropology and even linguistics or historians. And I think this is the goal of these new studies.
I can give an example of this in the study that Carlos and I collaborated, probably of all our studies, most closely on the population history of Iberian populations that Carlos presented a slide of. So what Carlos showed, if you remember, is from about 6,000 years ago to 4,500 years ago, there is no ancestry from the steppe north of the Black and Caspian Seas, the place where all this fighting is happening right now. But suddenly after 4,500 years ago, there's a massive infusion of ancestry from the steppe north of Black and Caspian Seas. It hits Iberia at this time, at about the same time it hits Britain. In Britain, it results in a minimum 90% replacement of the local population. In Iberia, the replacement and displacement of the local population is massive, but much more modest. Instead of minimum of 90%, more like 40%. However, as Carlos showed, within 500 years of this contact, essentially all the Y chromosomes, or nearly all the Y chromosomes carried by men, are from this Eastern population. They're not local Iberian. So what this means is that the local Iberian men were essentially almost completely unsuccessful at transmitting their Y chromosomes to subsequent generations, and that the incoming men were very much more successful in competing for reproductive access to local women. So what does this mean? We don't have a history of what happened here. But what we have is something extremely asymmetric. It could not have been a pleasant experience for the local male population at this time to not be successful at transmitting their Y chromosomes to subsequent generations. Now, what it meant, we don't know. Was it violent? Was it, marginalization? Was it We don't know. We don't have the direct evidence. Was this women from the local community playing an important role in selecting which men they wanted to interact with and mate with, and picking the men from abroad rather than the locals? But in any case, what it was an extreme asymmetric event. Roll forward 4,000 years to what happened with the descendants of these people in the Americas, when they got to the Americas, and something very dramatic happened where Iberians, European Iberians, exploited local Native American populations, and to some extent also African populations brought over by the transatlantic slave trade. And something very extreme happened where essentially all of the resulting population had European Y chromosomes, and almost all the local mitochondrial sequences, maternally transmitted ones, were either Native American and African. We know what happened there. That happened in the context of extreme exploitation we know about. We don't have the historical records for what happened in Iberia 4,500 years ago, because it was a pre-literate society. But from these modern examples and from the genetic evidence that shows this extreme asymmetry, we can perhaps begin to project. It adds to our information from other lines of evidence. Other questions that people might have. I wanted to comment, while we're talking about this, about another section of your book about the caste system and about people living and distinguishing themselves genetically and not mixing randomly with other people. You're right, we might wish to think that Western societies are free of castes, understood as rather hermetic social classes. But these societies are certainly social structured, and economic differences are to a large extent transmitted across generations. And even if we conclude that these structures are not as rigid and endogamous as those in India, it's also obvious that people do not get married nor have children at random within the population. So then you discuss several recent studies have attempted to investigate whether genetic differences can give rise to socioeconomic inequalities, as wealth also depends on some environmental factors such as educational attainment, how many years people have gone to school. And the conclusions of these studies are sometimes controversial. In a survey of more than 112,000 participants from the United Kingdom, Biobank, a long-term health resource for biomedical research with genetic as well as environmental information, researchers compared the genetic composition of low-income population samples with the wealthiest people in the data set. If genetic variants turned out to be significantly different between the groups compared, it could be supposed that they correspond to the genetic differences underlying these traits. The researchers found that genetic variation could account for 21% of the variation in social deprivation and 11% of the variation in household income. And you go on to describe that the evidence that genetic variation not only can be used potentially as a way to detect and study inequality events in the past, but might to some extent be a cause of it. I think this is going to be a top topic of your next week's talk with Catherine Page Harden, who's going to be talking about some of these same issues where genetic variation affects behavioral traits. And it's really quite upsetting and scary that there are these genetic signals in the data. But what does one do with it? One has to somehow deal with the fact that genetics data can reveal evidence of past extreme inequality and also may even contribute to social stratification, to the inequalities we see manifest around ourselves all the time. And so I think this is just something to, as Carla says, to roll around in our minds for a while.
Yeah, I mean, these figures can be interpreted in both ways. I mean, either, you know, the genetics has a very, you know, important role, or the environment has an important role also. I mean, the figures are, you know, maybe 40% can be explained from genetic, but, you know, then there is also the effect of the, you know, 60%, let's say. However, I think we all will agree that what is called assortative mating, so people not mating at random at all in modern societies, I think is something very obvious. People, it's obvious, but it's subtle. Let's say we think we are free of these kind of structures that we see in the past, social structures, but they are operating in a very subtle way. And then, you know, just the people is divided in quarters, in different, you know, in the city, living in a quarter is completely different to living in another one. It's like living in different villages, even if you are in the same city. So maybe you consider you are, you know, living in a particular place and you are sharing that city with 1 million, 2 million people, but in fact you are sharing the city with just your neighborhood. And the people who had the same, you know, social economical level, cultural level, etc. So the possibility of you know, mating at random in our societies are, you know, are really much smaller than we tend to think.
Yeah, and as I said, this will be perhaps a topic for the discussion next week. There are 2 remaining questions, and then I think that we will probably close the discussion. One of them is from Bonnie McFarland, which says, when I visited Puerto Rico, the tour guide said that most of the lineage from the native Caribs only continued through the female line because men were more susceptible to syphilis introduced by Europeans. Is it possible that there are other impacts from diseases and some of the radical decreases in male and female lineages? So this is an interesting question. The native indigenous Taino population of Puerto Rico indeed is more represented on the female line than on the male line in Puerto Ricans today in mixed form. And I think that an interesting question is, what is the cause of that? One alternative possible cause compared to different susceptibility to disease is just that men were not as successful at reproducing local indigenous men, and women tended to be more exploited by the almost overwhelmingly European male colonists, who were very much more male than female, and often, as are documented, took women. I think there may be some diseases that affect infectious diseases that affect women and men to a different extent. I think syphilis might have been endemic to the Americas rather than Europe, one of the few diseases rather than the opposite. But and actually, some people argue it moved to the old world from the new world, associated with the transatlantic exchange system that happened after people started moving across the Atlantic 500 years ago. But I think it's important to try to figure out how that's related. The other question is, there is this interesting contrast between your example from Iberia and the one from modern America. In the latter, we do not only describe the process of population replacement, but can contribute to social factors, the systems of exploitation. Then you move on to the Indian example where you note variation, but there seem to seek the causes to genetic factors, but correlation and causality are not the same. I'm not sure what's meant here by the Indian example. I think that there are probably many examples of inequality. There are certainly many examples of inequality manifest in genetic data from India. I completely agree that correlation and causality are not the same. I think genetics in many cases offers us the opportunity to tease those apart because we can actually directly test whether individual genetic variants are associated to particular outcomes. And that's one of the ways that genetics can help us to address this challenging problem of correlation and causality. I'd urge you to delve into this. I think that Carlos's book is quite challenging and disturbing, but also clear about the potential of this science to illuminate something that's very much with us today.
Great. So as David said, we should probably end soon, but I just wanted to give Carlos any last minute thoughts before we sign off for the evening. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation.
Yes, yeah, I don't know, just to conclude, if you want a positive message, I would say that the past is in our genes, but the future is in our hands.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks you once again, Carlos and David, for joining us this evening. Thanks to all of you out there for spending part of your evening with us. Please learn more about this incredible book and purchase Inequality, A Genetic History at harvard.com. I've put the link in the chat a couple times. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard Division of Science, and the Harvard Library, all here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a good night, keep reading, and be well. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye, Carlos. Bye, David.
Bye-bye. Keep reading.